Folks, welcome to our part two of our sustainable research training. My name is Martin Farley, and again, many thanks to FutureNeuro and ILAE's Climate Change Commission for facilitating today's training. Now, I'm going to jump right into where we left off. So in the last training, we were discussing and looking at the fact that there are three scopes of carbon, in terms of how we measure carbon emissions, and that scope 3 is typically our biggest impact. So that's in terms of what we purchase. So I'm going to go through and give some examples because one of the common questions I have is, how do we know what the most sustainable product is to buy? Now, this is oat milk, and this is nothing to do with your day-to-day work, but if you were to look at oat milk in the small print, they actually highlight the embodied carbon per kilogram. You can see it there in very small writing. Now, they don't have to do this. They do this because they know that the carbon of their product is far lower than, for example, cow's milk. And they do that as a way of highlighting one of the benefits, well, one of the ways that they market their product in terms of it being better for the environment. But sadly, we don't have a perfect system, so that understanding to that level of detail which product is better or worse for the environment doesn't really exist for laboratories or clinical settings. As a result, we have to make some considerations when we do purchases. Now, I'm going to talk about individual purchases, but one thing I want to mention is the top-down approach. So that's when we purchase a large amount of something. When you're purchasing a lot of something, you want it to essentially to put specifications for the products and materials to include environmental sustainability. You want there to be a weighting for environmental sustainability that's more significant than, well, as significant as possible. Often price is the #1 factor when purchasing materials, and that can sometimes shortchange you long-term because the cheapest materials to buy upfront might not last as long, and you might have to spend more long-term, and often you do. One thing I do want to mention is just that when you're doing any research, if you can use research platforms or core facilities, that's a great way to save costs as well, because it means that you don't have to make the large purchases yourself. Now, when you are making a large purchase, there's two things you want to consider. One is the company credentials. Now, in the UK, the NHS, for example, has a sustainable supplier roadmap, where essentially this is exactly what they're doing. They are asking all their suppliers to provide a carbon reduction plan or carbon management strategy for each manufacturer supplier for items they purchase over the, I think, a value of 5 million. And that's a great way to get companies to consider the embodied carbon with their materials, because if they have to reduce and become more efficient, then it means that there's a lower impact of the materials that you buy. So whenever you're making large purchases, please do ask your manufacturers and suppliers to have carbon management plans, carbon reduction plans, and I'll put some other examples on there of things you might want to ask for as well. Now, the other thing to consider is the credentials of the purchase. Now, that's really looking at the products or material or whatever you're buying. In an ideal world, you would get what we saw here, which was an embodied carbon figure. And you would get that through something like an LCA, which is a life cycle assessment. But the reality is most products and materials won't have this. So instead, you want to ask for a lot of other, well, there's other things you can ask for. So, for example, what is the energy consumption? That's an obvious one, but what is the water consumption? What is the materials consumption of the product or equipment that you're buying? And has it been validated? Quite often companies are the only source of information, and sometimes they present more favorable specs, making it harder to differentiate. So independent testing is a fantastic way to check for that. Also consider who's paying or owns the testing body. That might be going too far, sorry. But anyways, consider consumables required or parts required for equipment, and if there's a promise of a lifespan of those parts. So for example, how long can they promise that those parts will be provided for? Consider also the lifespan of the equipment and the materials. And then, of course, consider maintenance and if there are disposal and reuse plans for the product. These are great ways to get manufacturers and suppliers to think about environmental sustainability in a joined up way. Now, if you're purchasing individual items that aren't worth, let's say, millions, then quite often it's up to you to make individual decisions that inform about the environmental sustainability of the products you buy. Now, one way that I think is really good to address this is to look at guides for materials. Now, I've put a link there for a Sustainable Lab consumables guide, one of which I helped co-write, but it was essentially a guide to give people examples on how they can make more environmentally sustainable purchases when it comes to lab consumables. It's not a perfect guide because there's no perfect system yet out there. And I've put that the perfect metrics just don't exist yet. But there are things that you can do, and there's good examples in there. I'd really encourage you to take a guide like this if you work at your institution or your body, and consider making some of these available and sharing them around, or just put the best options that you know of. Typically, for example, if it's a plastic, can you go for a lower weight one? Actually, we'll go through some more examples around that in the subsequent trainings. But I also mentioned independent testing. If you can seek independent testing, and that's really by a third party that's not directly supported by the company itself. And I'm really sorry to say that we do have to have this sometimes, and that's because genuinely we do find a few companies, everybody says they have the most efficient unit, is what we say sometimes, and it's just not always true. So if you can seek a third party that's not financially motivated, something like Energy Star in the US or independent testers like in the UK, they can give you really good information about what the most sustainable option is. Now, one thing to watch out for is marketing. Now, everybody says that they have, the greenest or most efficient materials or equipment, and it's just to watch out that sometimes companies will put vague figures and some scores without methodologies. And when you see that, you might think to yourself, actually, that's more marketing. And really helpful information is when they actually provide testing conditions, when they show you the amount of plastic or the amount of energy that it saves, when it's compared, not a percentage. When they give you real figures, that's when you can have some certainty that actually what they're sharing with you is not marketing. Testimonials are really great as well when they're independent. Now, I wanted to share some examples because this sadly, in our current day and age, you do have to do some critical thinking about when something is environmentally sustainable or not. Now, this is a glove recycling program. Now, it sounds great, and I want to be more for this, but essentially this is focused on the recycling of plastic gloves and nitrile gloves, which would be ideal. The thing is that would require you to only purchase their gloves, despite that fact that other manufacturers also produce 100% nitrile gloves. So why would they not be able to recycle other manufacturers, and why do you only need to buy their gloves? Well, that's a slight alarm bell. The other thing is that they charge you for pickup for these gloves, and they only take uncontaminated gloves. So within a research setting, that can be really difficult to provide that certainty. And it means that you have to manage a different waste stream and pay for it. Now, I'd be okay with all of those things, actually, if they just could provide evidence that the gloves were actually recycled. And at least to date, that's not something that they're able to do. And I think without that evidence, then we have to be slightly dubious about what they're promoting, and if it's really not just a marketing scheme for their gloves. Now, I'm being very tough on them, but I think we have to be in this day and age. Now, we have to be tough because actually there's some companies that really just market a bit of nonsense. Now, this is a company that is producing single-use cages for mouse facilities. Now, if you've ever worked in an animal facility, you'll know that most cages are typically washed and reused, and that is better. It is better because any type of reuse, and I'll show you evidence later on for why, but it is better to reuse where you can. Now, the reason I'm picking on this supplier is because they actually marketed these as being, as you can see, with the 3 R's, and put some implication that this was better. And the reason they did that is because they said when you use a single-use mouse cage, you don't have to use your autoclave, so you don't have to use as much energy. Well, actually, that overall is worse for the environment because of the single-use plastic that you're enabling from this and the increased deliveries. And I'm giving this as an example because sadly, this is the type of critical thinking we have to apply to some suppliers when they promote things. Now, this is also a good example. This is something as a nonprofit, but their board is manufacturers and suppliers largely. Now, they produce this label, and to be honest, it's a fantastic idea. It's exactly what we need, which is a scoring system for the environmental sustainability credentials of the products. The thing is that it's not transparent, and as we understand, it's not baselined per. It's baseline per manufacturer, so that you can't compare it between manufacturers to know if a score is actually better between products, which really does challenge you to know what this is actually telling you, since they won't release the methodology and there's nothing about embodied carbon, and they don't actually test the equipment. They take all the credentials from the companies themselves without validating it. It's essentially just rehashing the product specifications, but in an environmental sort of, very nice image. As far as I'm concerned, doesn't really mean anything. But and companies pay for this, by the way. They pay for this label. So you do have to wonder, is this actually telling you something that's good about the product, or is it just telling you that they've paid for a label? Now, I'm being quite tough, but I think we have to be in this day and age. Now, this is another company that I think has tried to do good, and this is a company that sells tip washers. So they'll actually wash tips, and if you worked in a lab environment, single-use tips you produce a huge amount of. Now, you can use this equipment enough to validate the embodied carbon of the manufacturing and the energy used to run the equipment, but the company itself says it's done an independent life cycle assessment, which just says you need to, I think they say around 90 times that you run it, which just logically, when you look at how much metal and plastic goes into manufacturing this kit, there's a huge steel container underneath the bench that goes with it. That just can't be true. Now, I've done an independent validation of that, and I think the figure is more 10 times what their assessment is. And I'm not trying to be harsh, but I think I just want to highlight that companies are often favorable to promote themselves for environmental credentials, and sadly have to be a bit critical sometimes, because it's just to know, if we're going to pay for something and we're going to take extra time to do something for the environment, we want to know it's having an impact. Now, just so you know, I've been a bit harsh on some suppliers, but actually there are some that are doing a lot of good and doing it in a transparent way. This is a polyurethane molding supplier for actually lab supplies based in the UK, and they've actually gone to net zero for scopes 1 and 2 of carbon, and are trying to address their scope 3 long term. Now, when a company does something like this, it means that the plastic that you buy from them has a lower carbon impact because they themselves are using less carbon to produce it. And I think there's really good examples out there of folks that are really doing good. By the way, this is another example. This is a company that's based in the Netherlands. They'll take existing mass spectrometers and rebuild them to be as powerful, if not more powerful, than new units for a fraction of the price. So that's a win for the environment and a win for the wallet as well. So you can save money with companies like this. Now, I want to talk with the last few minutes about waste management, which is often at the forefront of everybody's mind when we think about laboratories. What percentage of healthcare waste is hazardous according to the World Health Organization? Now, by the way, I know that most labs will throw out around 70 to 90%, and they'll put it through clinical or hazardous waste. And that's not saying it's your lab, but it's a go-to in the name of health and safety that will put waste within hazardous waste streams. Their answer, by the way, was 15%, and I'm not saying only 15% of your waste is hazardous, but it's just to get you thinking about, actually, a lot of the waste we produce might not need to go down hazardous and clinical waste streams. And what can we do about it? Well, we can do a lot. Now, unless, I should add, if you're working in a category level 3 or containment level 3 lab, all of your waste typically will need to be incinerated in some specialist conditions, but any other space, you can recycle a lot of materials. The thing I have to add about this is that what you can recycle is genuinely site specific because it depends on your waste supplier. This means that you need to engage your facilities management about what plastics your supplier will take. Different suppliers will accept different plastics. Now, if you know, like your plastics at home, the plastics will be numbered 1 through 7. Typically, suppliers will take 1, 3, and 5, but not all of them will. And 1, 2, and 3, and 5. But you have to engage them about which plastics they'll take. And then you can consider doing something like this, where you introduce lab plastic recycling within your lab or clinical space. Yeah, if you do, by the way, please update your training, update your posters, engage everybody in the lab so they're aware of this, and produce some really nice signage that keeps things simple. Always keep it simple and do a bit of continual engagement on this, because whenever we change waste streams or waste practices, it's always that changeover where things are a bit messy and you might have a few issues. Consider your bin access, and I just mean in terms of location. Try not to put hazardous waste streams right next to recycling, because that, if you can separate them, it forces people to think about, put your hand towel waste, for example, near a sink, but not with a clinical waste bin right there, so that it forces people to not just mix them up. If you are doing a project like this, and if you are going to introduce lab plastic recycling or start to use it more, then I would really recommend estimating cost savings. And the reason I say that is because actually clinical and hazardous waste streams cost 3 to 10 times more, actually 5 to 10 times more than recycling waste streams. In other words, if you recycle, you save money as opposed to hazardous waste. Now, in terms of waste, recycling is good, but reduction and reuse is absolutely paramount. It's a lot better when you can reuse things than recycle. Now, there are some schemes from some companies that allow you to reuse items or recycle. There's tip box recycling schemes, or of course you can reuse your tip box. Some companies will take back packaging, very few. Solvent bottles that are glass Winchester bottles can be actually reused by most suppliers if your stores will store them up and send them back. At the end of the day, any type of reuse is better as well as reduction than recycling. People often ask about, is glass or plastics better? Reuse is the most important factor in them. Glass typically allows you to reuse it more, but reusing plastics is fantastic as well. Okay, well, we've gone through quite a bit there, and I'm going to take a break now, but I wanted to just go over some take-home messages for you. When you're making large purchases, engage the manufacturers about long-term sustainability. So consider that they have carbon management plans, and ask about the sustainability of the credentials of the materials that you buy. Think critically about what companies claim. They will be marketing materials to sell based on environmental credentials, and sadly, there's no perfect system yet to assess them. So in the interim, we do need to really consider, when somebody says something is better, what is the evidence that they're providing? And I'm sorry that we have to do it, but we do. In terms of waste management in the lab, introduce recycling if you can. Don't put everything through hazardous and clinical waste streams, but reuse is absolutely the best if you can. If you're going to introduce any recycling schemes, ensure that you engage your waste supplier, your facility management, and any lab services to find solutions. And that's it for today. So I'm going to stop there. And in part 3, we're going to look at, that's actually incorrect there, but we're going to look at single-use plastics and cold storage and actually look at consumable materials. Thank you. Bye-bye.